Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, where we discuss things of all kinds that are imaginary, specifically science fiction, film, television, and literature. And today we are very, very excited, and we is me and my co-host Tony. Say hi, Tony.
Hello, Tony.
We are going to talk about something we're passionate about, and we've been dropping hints about
for ages
weeks and months, possibly the whole time that we've been doing this podcast. So today we are going to talk about Octavia Butler. And I discovered Octavia Butler through Tony. So I'm going to turn this straight over to you, Tony. How did you discover Octavia Butler? Where, when? Give me all of the details.
All right. So serendipity is the quick answer. The longer answer is serendipity, but... So this was fall of 2013. Fall of 2013, and I was teaching an honors composition class at the university where Kendra and I got our MFAs. And I was basing it around science fiction. And for the first unit, I wanted the students to read a lot of science fiction. Obviously, I could either have them read like one or maybe two novels, which wouldn't give them that much exposure, or I could have them read a bunch of short stories. So I picked some short stories that I knew and I really liked, and I went on the internet and I was like trawling around, and I was like, all right, introduction to science fiction, what should people be reading? And of course the internet had 8 million suggestions, but I sort of skimmed through a few of them, looked at what short stories popped up on multiple lists, who was writing the lists, where the lists were coming from, and I curated a list of maybe 12 or 13 stories. I had actually never heard of Octavia Butler at that point. I hadn't read a whole lot of science fiction that wasn't... I read a lot of science fiction when I was growing up for kids, but I didn't read a lot of adult science fiction up through that point. So I had some staples on the list. I had Arthur C. Clarke. I had Harlan Ellison.
Le Guin, probably?
I did have Le Guin, yeah. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. I had Larry Niven. I had Neil Gaiman. So, older, newer staples. I had Samuel Delany. So, getting a little bit into the more revolutionary political science fiction. I had something by Connie Willis. And then I had the short story Speech Sounds by Octavia Butler. And I remember that I liked it, but some of the stories definitely resonated with my students, and they were into a few of them. But Speech Sounds, for some reason, really hit a lot of people. And, I mean, this is, a big state university, so, and it was an honors class, so a lot of the kids were white. But a lot of them connected with this story for some reason. So... read that story, assigned it to students, did that multiple semesters in a row, had a lot of students connect with that story, really liked it, but I never picked up Octavia Butler after that. I didn't say, wow, this story is really great, I want to go read one of her books. She was, as far as I was concerned, just Speech Sounds at that point. Until about a year later, when I was really ratcheting up my science fiction. I was reading a lot of old stuff, I was reading a lot of newer stuff. So I read both parable books, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, and they were surrounded by this nebulous reading list that included things like Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke, A Leaf the Unseen by G. Willow Wilson, The Doomsday Book by Connie Willis, The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard, The Foundation books by Isaac Asimov. So I was basically creating my science fiction canon at that point. And some of the books stuck around. I also read The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin for the first time.
One of my favorites.
Right, definitely became one of my favorites. And then the parable books became really important in a way that a lot of the books at that time did, but some of them to a lesser degree, some of them to a greater degree. So really, my story of Octavia Butler was coming to her accidentally, but then picking up her novels for the first time about a year after that, and having her form the part of the foundation of what I understood science fiction to be.
She's a fascinating character to me, too, because for so long, Octavia Butler, and this is coming from recent forays into the nebulous internet myself, but she has operated for so long on the fringes of science fiction. She was mainstream without having mainstream, I guess, recognition, in that she was writing during the same period as many other of the science fiction authors that I am passionate about today. Le Guin, Atwood, she was writing at the same period, but she wasn't being collected in the same anthologies. She wasn't being placed in the same conversations.
Yes.
And so when she exploded onto my imaginary scene, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of having been deprived, because she is an author of quality. She is an author of great talent, and an author with a sensitivity to ongoing social, cultural, and political issues about which I, too, am passionate. So I don't know how she didn't make it into the anthologies I was reading, except to say that now I know those anthologies are mostly white. And so racial politics do have a lot to say about, or have had a lot to say about where Octavia Butler became known during her lifetime. She was unfortunately taken away from us in 2006.
Yeah.
And, so she was writing during my lifetime. And I'm a little upset that I didn't know this while she was alive, if that makes sense. There are certain authors that I come to shortly after their deaths, and I'm like, oh no.
Yeah.
I could have been reading you while you were publishing. And I know that doesn't technically make a difference about like what she produced, but it might have had an influence on how I received her.
Yeah.
And because it's always going to be me coming late to the party. I don't know if that makes sense, but...
Yeah.
So when we talk about your early encounters with Octavia Butler, teaching Octavia Butler, her appeal to your students, how would you say your relationship with her evolved as you dove into her other works?
One of the reasons that she was so revolutionary to me, and why I think she attracted a lot of my students, is that the way that she does science fiction is very much not in the same... It wasn't similar to what we were reading. Like, we were reading a lot of space science fiction and so on and so forth.
So what you might consider like the archetypal science fiction.
Yes. We were reading a lot of archetypal science fiction. And I remember very clearly... assigning the short story The Cold Equations by Tom Godwin, which is like one of the science fiction stories as far as I was concerned teaching this class, and then to turn to Octavia Butler and the short story Speech Sounds, which is just rife with these social issues, with layers upon layers that you can dissect. It's the sort of story that you're more accustomed to seeing in an English class. And I don't mean to say that science fiction, space science fiction, doesn't belong in an English class, because it definitely does. But for some reason, the students picked up on this story and this view of science fiction, this view of imaginary and speculation, and ran with it. And that's honestly, I think, what brought me into it, and what brought me to reading the Parable books in the first place. And I wish I could reconstruct exactly why then, and what led me to the Parables first, as opposed to any of her other books, but I can't. And that is something that is cool, that I ended up there first. And that's something that, I think about when I think about my foundation in science fiction. Like, it was created by books like The Dispossessed and like the two Parables books, as much as it was Rendezvous with Rama and Leviathan Wakes and the other books I was reading in that summer, in that year.
and oh man, okay. So my first read of Octavia Butler after you recommended her was Lilith's Brood.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole time I was reading it, I was like, is this the right place to start? Like, is this the book I'm supposed to start Octavia Butler with? So there's a little bit of a disjointure in me reading Octavia Butler for the first time, because she's an author where I didn't quite know how to get my bearings in her work. It was just enough different that there was something disconcerting about it, but it was also eerily familiar in certain ways. It felt more like inhabited science fiction, a little bit less speculative in the sense of placing us in imaginary worlds that we can't possibly ever visit.
Yeah.
And a little bit more like, here's a world that is ours, just slightly and eerily changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that, but Lilith's Brood takes place on, a very changed Earth.
Mm-hmm.
It involves aliens and spaceships, and spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for most of them.
Yeah.
And so I say that, but at the same time, like, there's nothing that could be more removed from my world than the world of Lilith's Brood. So I don't know if we want to talk a little bit about how she actually puts her sentences together, her paragraphs, her worlds, because there's something, I think, more structural that is familiar than plot that's familiar, at least in that particular book. So have you read Lilith, and when, and what was your reaction?
Yes. And I want to say about a year after I first picked up the Parables, so sometime in 2015, but it might have been 2014 too. I can't remember. In response to the Parables, I felt like I was actually very well placed in Lilith's Brood because I had experienced the Parables, and I sort of knew that there were similarities in the characters who Octavia Butler tended to inhabit primarily. And so I felt like even though we weren't dealing with the same main character as we were dealing with in the Parable books, I was ready to pick up Lilith's Brood and stick with it and understand where the characters were coming from, how Octavia Butler was writing about them, the way that she was structuring her thoughts in her books. And it was generally, I want to say, I can't even remember how I then responded to seeing that Octavia Butler was picking up aliens and starships and dealing with all this stuff. But I will say that I remember I've talked about my foundation in adult science fiction and its recentness. Like, we're talking about, 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
My science fiction basics go back long, long, long before that. So when I pick up a book or watch a movie or something, for example, the ideas of the aliens there are always and necessarily parsed through, say, Animorphs, which was really important to me when I was a kid and, didn't have the most original ideas. But when I was a kid, I hadn't really read a whole lot other than that, except for seeing Star Trek. So the aliens and Animorphs were fairly foundational. So when I think about what makes an alien, it goes through the Animorphs filter in my mind, because that was where I was coming from. So when I thought about aliens the alien in Octavia Butler, it was very different than, say, the way we talked about Alien in Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy.
Sure.
Because obviously they were alien and that was not up for grabs. But the fact that some of their alienness was sexual and yet not sexual, or yet some of the sexuality was not alien, was something that was very, very new. And I remember that as sticking with me primarily, because that was something I had never read before. That was, a sequence of ideas that I was unprepared to deal with, even though I was prepared for so much else in Octavia Butler's writing.
So You actually touched on one of the things which I really wanted to talk about in the context of Octavia Butler, which is sexuality.
Yes.
As a sub point amongst many when we talk about Octavia Butler, and I have a tenuous love-hate relationship to the depiction of sexuality in Lilith's Brood specifically. I surprisingly had almost no reaction whatsoever in reading the Parable of the Sower. I have yet to read Parable of the Talents. I haven't yet found a copy in my local indie bookstore. Plug. But in Lilith's Brood, the assumption there is that everyone is sexual on some level. And I mean, I think Octavia Butler herself probably was aware that not everyone was, but the way that the alien is mingled with the human in terms of sexuality renders every human susceptible to this weird sexuality. And spoiler alert, I'm an asexual, and so that is a repellent notion to me on a level that it might not be to other people. The notion of compulsory sexuality, period, is very repellent. So I think probably if I was to sit down and have a beer with Octavia Butler in 1990 something before she passed away, she would have totally understood where I was coming from. But it's a conversation that never quite rises to the top in Lilith's Brood. The notion that there's variety in human sexuality, and that component of the human alien hybrid sexuality it just doesn't get discussed, and that's very, very problematic to me. And I was wondering if you had any reaction to the uniformity of sexuality in her universe, that specific universe, and how it plays out on the page.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because number one, I fully agree with you. Number two, I could level the same critique that we don't see any queer sexuality in that book. Well, you just said that. You said one aspect of queer, so I could broaden that and say we don't really see any depictions of queer sexuality.
Sure.
And yet, I actually think the book is doing some really queer things with sexuality, in that we
Do tell.
Well, we're totally breaking from these mores that say sexuality, when it happens at the baseline, has to happen with other, and obviously this will be a best case scenario, but with other consenting sentient beings, if it happens at all. And what she's saying is she's not breaking from that, but there's something very queer about not only involving multiple partners, but involving multiple partners who aren't even human but are sexually compatible. And I think that's really interesting. And let's contrast it maybe with a book like Luna New Moon, which showed a whole lot of human sexuality, a whole spectrum of human sexuality, and did a pretty good job and made it really sexy. And I remember that you leveled the same critique there, that the A in that book, if we're thinking of the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, was autosexual and not asexual or aromantic, which was its own brand of problematic, as you pointed out in that podcast.
Which is not to say that autosexual is not accepted. It's just, it's reductive to say that is what the A is.
Yes. So what I enjoy about what Lilith's Brood did is it wasn't really trying to me to represent that same spectrum of human sexuality in the way that a book like Luna New Moon was trying to do, but it was trying to say, okay, here's one part of sexuality, and let's make it queerer than we could imagine prior to this book. And I think that's why it stuck with me, because it was this queer depiction of kind of like heterosexual for reproduction sex, which, if it had not been queered, I would not really be interested in. But because she was doing different things with it, it stuck with me, and it seemed new and innovative and interesting, and I was right there, even though I didn't really want to be.
Well, and I think it's also worth pointing out that we don't have to want to inhabit a world in order to appreciate what the world is doing on a literary level, and just kind of reiterating that is our stance on science fiction, period. I think that's probably enough said for me. I feel like pretty much all of my points about sexuality in science fiction could be boiled down to enough said. Like, I just want to state my position and then get out.
I think that's totally. If I can follow up on that, I think you absolutely should keep saying that, though, because it's really tough not to see yourself represented. And as you know, I think you're absolutely right. If you'd sat down with Octavia Butler and had a beer in like the late 90s or the early 2000s and said, hey, this was awesome, but like she would have been really open to that. And the fact that we are having these conversations at all, I think, is not only super important, but also like gives me hope for the future. Like there is science fiction, there will be science fiction that really speaks for everyone, that captures sexuality in a really non-reductive, non-problematic way. And so I want you to keep talking about it.
Well, then I will. But moving on a little bit, Lilith's Brood, the Xenogenesis trilogy, as it is often called, was published it was written in the mid to late 80s, which was a different time. And one of the things I love about Octavia Butler is everything I've read about her writing process renders her very, very human.
Oh, yeah.
In that she experienced writer's block and just like threw up her hands and couldn't complete the third in the Parable series. And, that came later, but she was always very, very responsive to her time. So in the mid 80s, she was writing Blood Child, which I haven't read, and the Xenogenesis trilogy, which I have read. And she was reacting to current events, and she was writing, and it was all very quick. Like from the event to the reaction to the writing to publication was only ever a couple of years, which science fiction, as I grew up with it, and I don't know if your experience was similar, but the science fiction, the way I grew up with it, was much more monolithic in that you had a grand idea and you spent 5 to 10 years laboring over the grand idea. And then you published your work and it might operate independently of the events or affairs that inspired it. And so science fiction was always a little bit more removed that way for me than perhaps other genres, except for historical fiction, which I read a fair amount of when I was young. And so it was always very, like, I hold forth on this grand notion. And then I read Octavia Butler, and it's like, I react to this little tiny thing that happened in history last week. And here it is on the page. And that was really fresh and exciting and enticing for me. So there's a certain reactionary element to Butler that I want to talk a little bit about. And I thought we might do that by transitioning to talking about the Parable series itself. And the Parable series, of course, is Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. The third book in that trilogy, it was always envisioned as a trilogy, was never completed because of the aforementioned writer's block. So let's talk about that a little bit and her politicalness, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to mention because there is this sense in a lot of her contemporaries, I mean, even up through the 80s, into the 90s, even now, of science fiction's aloofness, of this these many degrees of removal you needed to have in order to talk about political things, in order for science fiction to be political. I'm even thinking of, like, Star Trek in the 80s, and, it could comment obliquely on the Cold War, but it had to be the Federation and the Romulans. There couldn't be any direct commentary on what was going on. And
Sure.
Which is not to say that one is better than the other. Like, allegory is very important as well. But the way that Octavia Butler was doing some things, and here, I'm thinking directly of the parables or of something like Speech Sounds, which were allegorical, which were, set in science fiction, but weren't quite as removed, or, were much closer to the sort of reality that Octavia Butler was seeing and responding to and politicizing or responding to the politics of. There's actually, before we get back to the parables, I want to read you just this little bit. So my copy of her short story, Speech Sounds, comes with this afterword that she wrote in the first person about her process. And I don't want to read you the whole thing. It's only about a page, but I want to read you the first paragraph. Just to humanize her, like you said, get a sense of who Octavia Butler was while she was writing the story. She says,
Sure, go for it.
quote, "Speech Sounds was conceived in wariness, depression, and sorrow. I began the story feeling little hope or liking for the human species, but by the time I reached the end of it, my hope had come back. It always seems to do that. Here's my story behind Speech Sounds."
I think, oh man, I love that because it does seem very much typical of her, prototypical of her. And, you were talking about monolithic texts, or like Star Trek being one of these more monolithic grand scope texts. And I even think of like the E.M. Banks Culture series.
Yeah.
I think of Tchaikovsky's Children of Time. These are books which they take it as a necessary ingredient that we have grand epic scope, either in terms of generations or in terms of interstellar space, that those are necessary to examine like the politics of human behavior. But one of the things that is Butler's strength, and I think this is also the strength of several other writers of color that we are following right now, including Nnedi Okorafor, who we will come back to, is that they focus into the hyper-specific, the hyper-local, and they let these human events play out on a very personal, intimate scale, which I think is beautiful. And it's one of the things that makes me a little wary of the current trend to lionize Octavia Butler's parable series specifically for being like a political commentary on America and America's politics, and a template for, like her dystopia as a template for dealing with Donald Trump as our president, which you sent me an article earlier, several days ago, which came out in the Mary Sue. And for the most part, the article is really thought-provoking and wonderful. However, this is how it opens. And this is how I want to dive into talking about the parable series. It opens, "We are living inside a nightmare. We are living inside a massive practical joke. We are looking to the stars for possible new homes, and we exhaust our current planet's resources and turn on each other in wars that increase in danger as they decrease in dignity. We are being asked to make impossible compromises while our children watch. We are a multitude of resistances and resiliences in action. Is this fiction or reality?" And I think that kind of framing is how we are talking about on a widespread cultural level, is how we're talking about Octavia Butler right now. And I don't know that that's how she would have wanted to be read.
No.
Because she was all about the personal and the intimate. And that's all I have to say for transition into talking about the parables. So take it away a little bit on your experience.
I agree with you. I'm actually going to tilt that idea about 30 degrees and say definitely she was focused on the personal. But if I had to compare Octavia Butler's writing to someone else in terms of what she's doing thematically, I would actually put her in a room with Kim Stanley Robinson. And here's why. Octavia Butler is a pessimist in the short term, but an optimist in the long term. She's someone who, with the parable books, with Lilith's Brood, even with something like Kindred, thought that personal relationships were, first of all, very important. The social context in which they operated was super important. The relations that people had were super important. But all of those were kind of shitty. Like, people would be shitty to each other. Like, that's what you find time and again in Octavia Butler's books. And yet, she was still optimistic about humanity. Humanity would go on to something better. There was also good in us. And part of that, what I read in Speech Sounds, or what she was writing in response to Speech Sounds, was that she started the story, she wrote about some of those people, and she had lost her hope in humanity. And yet, by the time she had reached the end of that story, by the time she'd written it all, she'd found her hope again. And that is Octavia Butler's arc in almost all of her books. And I don't mean to say that she gets uninteresting or repetitive or anything. I actually love that because we almost have no one else who does that. I think Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the few people who does it every now and again. But generally you find, as we said in our Dystopia podcast, there's a lot of focusing on the present, or a lot of trying to get authors or texts to focus on the present and be with us in our anger and our depression, and that's important. And I think that's part of the reading that's going on with Octavia Butler now. But we do ourselves a disservice if we focus then only on things like Star Trek or the culture, which present these grand visions of an optimistic future, but not how we get there. What Octavia Butler does is she sits right in the middle and says, okay, shit is going on, but we can get better. And that's what I love about her. And that's really the heart of Octavia Butler in my readings.
Although I might argue, I don't know, I would push back a tiny bit against that. I mean, talk about turning it 30 degrees. Because Lilith Sprood, if anything, presents certain specific empathetic characters, but broadly speaking, a static humanity. Humanity remains the same. It's the relationship between the human and the alien that evolves. Mm-hmm. And that is, I think, part of the point of the book, but also perhaps one of the things that frustrated me a little bit about the book. Mm-hmm. Because, yes, humanity is shitty, and I kind of want your optimism to bleed through a little bit more in terms of seeing us as capable of on our own without, being genetically altered by the alien to evolve.
Yeah. And I actually, now that I'm thinking about that, I think that one of the reasons why I have that particular reading of Octavia Butler is because I started with the parable books. And I don't know that would affect it
so much. No, I think that would affect it so much because I did the reverse. I started with the Lilith Sprood Xenogenesis trilogy, and then I transitioned to Parables, and I have yet to finish Parables, but I have to say it took me forever to get through Lilith Sprood. I enjoyed it, but I was also really skeptical the whole time, which is a hard way to read a science fiction book. Whereas as soon as I cracked open the cover of Parable of the Sower, I was in. Yeah. I was involved, and I finished that book in one sitting. Mm-hmm. So there is something about the readability of Parable, which I would highly recommend as an entry point for people coming to Octavia Butler. I think she got better as she got older at writing these longer texts. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a wholeness to the vision of Parable of the Sower that I really appreciate and fell in love with. But your conversation about Kim Stanley Robinson got my mind going a little bit. And it turns out that they are of the same generation. Mm-hmm. So she was born in 47. He was born in 52. They came of age, so to speak, and started writing around the same time. And it'll be interesting to discover. We both have sort of slight acquaintance with Kim Stanley. We could possibly at some point pose the question about whether he had a chance to meet her, or converse with her on a literary level, because there are elements of Kim Stanley's books that really try to get at this race thing in a way that's very deliberate. Mm-hmm. And I would wonder how someone like Octavia Butler, who inhabits that space so easily and comfortably and wholly and compassionately, would respond to someone like Kim Stanley Robinson, who for the most part is coming from a very different kind of California to the California that she wrote from. And so, and another random thing, Kim Stanley has a book coming out this year, set in the future in New York. So if you happen to like disaster, not necessarily disaster, ecological futurism, then you might want to consider picking that book up. I believe it's New York 2140. So continuing his trend of 2312 and books that start with numbers.
Yes.
But back to Octavia Butler. Okay, so we've discussed her early work, her short stories. We've discussed the middle in Lilith's Brood, and we've discussed the Parable series a little bit. And of course, we've been a little bit scattershot about it. We like to be messy on this podcast.
Yeah.
But let's start wrapping it back to try and discover some sort of holistic vision of her work. You know, when you step back from her whole body of work and take a look at what she was doing and what she contributed to science fiction, you know, what would you say are the things that she brings to what we read that is different, that alters how we read science fiction?
Yeah. She demands a conversation about race relations. She demands a conversation about sex and gender and sexuality. I think this is part of the not ascribing to the degree of removal that science fiction, especially allegorical science fiction, had done and continues to do. She peeled away some of those layers and gave you something that was much more raw and wasn't afraid to tackle some of those ideas. Because I don't think that she was alone in that conversation. It had to be a conversation. But she was giving voice to things that didn't tend to make the mainstream voice in science fiction, which was often sort of derided, even now, but certainly going back a few decades, as really only pulps or, something without the sort of heft, the sort of textual necessary heft that literary fiction would have. And I think that even though, I wouldn't say that was the main takeaway, or that's the point of Octavia Butler's body of work, but the fact that it resists erasure at every turn, in every book, in every story, is so important. And, talking about bleeding over, some of Octavia Butler's work refused the label of meaningless science fiction, of pulp science fiction, of science fiction that couldn't be taken seriously. Octavia Butler herself received the MacArthur Genius Grant, which had never gone to a writer who primarily works in science fiction. You find Octavia Butler's books, and I started this podcast by saying that I used her short story Speech Sounds in a college class. Granted, that college class was devoted to science fiction, but you find her books, like Lilith's Brood, like Kindred, used in college classrooms that are focusing on things like race relations, that are focusing on things like gender relations, gender parity, things like that. And I think that's so important and so interesting that we can take Octavia Butler and we can sort of mobilize her at this point as this warning siren in response to what's going on in contemporary U.S. politics. And I think you're absolutely right that that's doing her a massive disservice if that's as far as we take her body of work. And I've said in previous podcasts that I'm annoyed when science fiction is treated as important only because it could potentially be predictive. So I won't rehash that argument. But the fact that Octavia Butler with Kindred has a place in a classroom that's also taken by Toni Morrison or Alice Walker, that is so important, not just for Octavia Butler, but for science fiction generally, and for folks who are coming up and reading science fiction and writing science fiction, especially for writers who are women, writers who are writers of color, women writers of color, to see that, for example, you could be exposed to someone like Toni Morrison, but also to someone like Octavia Butler in the same class. Think of how potentially revolutionary that could be.
It would have revolutionized my high school experience for sure if I'd been exposed to her, which is one of the reasons why I'm a little bit resentful of history for taking her away before I had a chance to grow up with her. I think growing up with Octavia Butler could change a person's life.
Yeah.
Not in a way that's wrenching or that fractures your childhood experience in any way from what it would otherwise have been, but in a way that really enriches how you frame conversations about hierarchies, about the body as a collective and a physical thing. Her writing of the body is superb. And if there's any time of life when you really need a holistic appreciation of the body and its capabilities and its beauties and its troubles, then that's, when you're going through puberty. I think my life would have been better with Octavia Butler in it when I was younger. And I think it's phenomenal that she's in classrooms and entering classrooms. She certainly wasn't in mine. And I don't know that she's in or going to be in every classroom that teaches politically engaged fiction. And that's a little sad to me because there's a lot of wonderful work out there. So I'm not saying that, students will necessarily be put at a disservice. I mean, if you're reading Kwame Alexander in your class, you're doing good. If you're reading Jacqueline Woodson in your class, you're doing good. But if you're reading Octavia Butler in your high school classroom, whoa, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that. So I think we could really get behind, seeing more of her work, in the future. And I think we will see more of it. I think it's an inevitable, I almost think it's inevitable because her work is the ultimate protest fiction. It's not protest fiction in that it explicitly calls out certain political movements or, et cetera, et cetera. It's protest fiction because it resists.
Yeah.
As you say, because it persists.
Yes.
Despite everything that is out there trying to stamp out voices like hers.
Yeah.
Octavia Butler persists.
Yeah.
And I think that's beautiful. But I was hoping that we could close out this podcast by circling back to it's Kindred, correct?
Yes, it is.
And you mentioned that your copy of Kindred has an introduction by another author that we're hoping to discuss later on our podcast, which is Nnedi Okorafor. Could you talk a little bit about that?
This is, I should clarify that this isn't my copy of Kindred the novel, but is rather an interpretation or an adaptation of Kindred as a graphic novel by Damian Duffy and John Jennings. I believe who did what?
Someone wrote, someone illustrated, probably.
I think they both did some of both. I can't find right now who was responsible for what specifically, but Damian Duffy and John Jennings were responsible for this adaptation of Octavia Butler's novel Kindred, and Nnedi Okorafor wrote a foreword to Kindred that talked about her experience with the book, why it's still important, which, was just really lovely to read.
So I suppose our homework for you, dear listeners of this podcast, is to go out and find this graphic novel adaptation of Kindred, to read it and to read the introduction by Nnedi Okorafor. Because one of the things that you might discover about Octavia Butler is that it's hard to know where to start. So a great starting point is with this graphic novel adaptation. If you've never read any of her work, it might be the bridge that you need. And I personally recommend also starting with the Parable series. I think it's one of her most accessible works. And I personally love her long form writing. I'm sure her short stories are incredible, but I struggle with short stories. Which is going to come up in our podcast about the novella in the future. I want more. I'm really, really greedy with my science fiction. So, any final thoughts on on Octavia Butler for today's podcast?
I think that if I can circle back to one thing,
Sure.
I would say, because I want to, jump on that bandwagon and say Octavia Butler is more important now than ever. And I don't think that's wrong. I think that what's going on now in U.S. politics makes reading Octavia Butler not only important, but an act of resistance, like you said. But I do want to underscore that I think if we're just reading Octavia Butler with that single goal in mind, to be resistant, to see it as a mirror of U.S. politics, as a thing to avoid because of its predictive powers, whatever you want to say, it really is doing her a disservice. I don't want to say she's worth keeping around only because of her relevance to current politics in the United States right now. So if you haven't read Octavia Butler, I want to say but I think I speak for both of us.
You do.
We really encourage you to pick her up, but pick her up and read her on a lot of different levels. Don't limit your reading to just one that's in response to current politics.
I agree. I think it would be a mistake to say that Octavia Butler's relevance can be attributed to the politics that she displays, the political structures she depicts in her novels. I think the magnificence and perhaps one of the most important ingredients to her long-term persistence and relevance is the fact that she's very nonchalant about political structures. She'll tackle hierarchy as a concept, as a root concept, and she will depict things that sound eerily familiar, like a president who wants to make America great again, direct quote, from the book, which came out a long time ago, by the way. But at the same time, those feel like gifts and happy surprises when you stumble across them in the text. Those moments where the politics of her books mirrors the politics of the current age. For the most part, these books really aren't concerned with grand schemes of politicians in Washington meddling and doing, whatever. They're concerned with the character at the heart of the book. So Lilith in Lilith's Brood, and what's the character's name in Parable? Now I'm blanking.
Lauren Olamina.
That's right. I always forget it. I guess because it's such a normal, useful name.
Lauren.
And Lauren in the Parable books, they are characters that you journey with almost as a second skin. You're so close to these characters that politics almost doesn't affect you, almost as it doesn't affect the ordinary person in their day-to-day life. The grand politics and things like that. So what's pleasurable, what's magnificent about Butler is her understanding of what's human, what makes us good or not good, what leads to a future we can believe in. And I think also her capacity to be compassionate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really wonderful. So go read Octavia Butler, homework, pick up a copy and peruse and enjoy. And that if you have any insight about what you want to hear next, please get in touch with us on Twitter at imaginary_pod.
Yes.
And you can also get in touch with us by emailing us or by visiting us at www.imaginaries.us. Closing thoughts, Tony?
Read Octavia Butler.
Read Octavia Butler, and we will see you soon.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.